America's been lying to you about haunted houses. We'll spend millions on Victorian horror movies, while the actual most haunted house in America, it's a plantation that Hollywood pretends doesn't exist.
This is what's known as America's most haunted house, the Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana.
Even on YouTube, from Sam and Colby, Brennan Taylor, Overnight, and City Boys have all made treks to Myrtles Plantation to millions of views. But when Hollywood needs a horror backdrop, it rarely picks plantations. It picks Victorians. It's fascinating. Stranger Things gave us the Creel House, an imposing Victorian built in 1882. Horror after horror, from Hill House to Crimson Peak, leans on that same silhouette.
Those Victorian houses were not built to be scary. They were symbols of wealth and empire, just like plantations. But as Victorian silhouettes rose in London, Boston, and San Francisco, antebellum homes were rising across the American South.
Now ask yourself, why do we haunt Victorians but not antebellum homes? Same century, same grand facades. But one style screams horror and the other gets romanticized. That's not just an architectural quirk. It's a ghost story about memory. Because if haunted houses reveal what a culture is afraid to face, then maybe America's scariest ghosts, they're hiding in plain sight. And that's what this video essay is about. Not whether the haunted house trope is tired, but whether we've just been haunting the wrong houses all along. By the way, most haunted house in America is a label dozens of places fight over. Travel and Leisure just listed 12 most haunted places in America last month. Winchester Mystery House, Amityville, not one plantation made the list. That tells you something. Ghost stories aren't just folktales, they're cultural choices.
Find a gateway to the Upside Down by visiting this historic property in Georgia. While most recently, it was featured as the Creel House in Season 4 of Stranger Things, the Claremont House, a sprawling Gothic Victorian mansion built in 1882.
All this talk about most haunted houses leaves the question, who gets to be haunted?
This is about power, who had it, who abused it, and who gets remembered.
Here's what's insane. We turn the houses of our former colonizers into horror icons, but the houses where we were the oppressors, those become wedding venues.
Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Americans adopted a lot of things from the British: literature, architecture, clothing style, language, and slavery.
But here's what's interesting. We also adopted their Gothic horror traditions, so why didn't antebellum homes become horror icons the way Victorian houses did?
But the actual architectural style, textbook architectural style, Greek revival. Why? Because during the antebellum era, everybody who was rich was really into classical shit. That was just like the trend of the time. They were really into Greek and Roman classics. And so these houses are designed with Greek and Roman temples in mind. That's why they're white. That's why they have pillars in the front.
She nails it. We're talking about Greek revival architecture, not some mysterious plantation style. Rich Americans copied Greek temples to symbolize democracy and American ideals. Ironic, huh? The style literally represented the young nation's hope to survive as a democracy. But here's the irony. Victorian mansions, which came later and represented British wealth, became our horror symbols. So we chose symbols of foreign empire for horror while keeping symbols of American democracy romantic. The psychology behind this choice reveals everything. And scary stories in Victorian houses were already connected.
Writers like Edgar Allan Poe turned their old wallpaper and empty hallways into symbols for things falling apart.
You see, Gothic literature also carried an aspect of social commentary toward the wealthy, the rich, those who were morally rotting on the inside. There's psychology behind this choice.
This wasn't accidental.
Edgar Allan Poe was writing about fictional decay while real American darkness was happening just miles away. The pattern isn't coincidence. So what do you think? Why didn't plantation horror become a consistent representation in Hollywood? Actually, let's pause here because I just realized something wild. Think about our classic monsters. Dracula from Gothic Transylvania, Frankenstein from Swiss Romantic literature, Jekyll and Hyde from Victorian London, the Mummy from ancient Egypt. Even the Wolfman traces back to European folklore. America borrowed all its monsters from other cultures. We took Haitian zombies, European vampires, British mad scientists. But what about America's own monsters? Where is the horror that was born right here? It's like we're perfectly comfortable exploring everyone else's darkness, but when it comes to American-made horror, suddenly we need to import our nightmares from overseas. And this pattern continues today. In 2025 alone, we're getting Del Toro's Frankenstein and The Bride, two Victorian monster remakes. And just last year, we had Nosferatu. Hollywood consistently chooses Victorian horror over plantation settings. The pattern is undeniable. What other movies shaped how we see architecture? Drop your theories in the comments. Makes you wonder what American story we chose not to preserve.
Welcomed home to the most well-preserved Victorian mansion in New England. The ghost of Lizzie Park comes down the stairs every day at 4 p.m.
We were in the antebellum period, the time before the Civil War, and there were two competing literary traditions happening simultaneously. Plantation fiction romanticized enslavement as family loyalty, painting enslaved people as content and loyal. But enslaved people were creating their own stories, horror stories about witches who could ride you at night, conjure workers who could curse enemies, protective rituals involving salt and brooms. Writer Zora Neale Hurston documented how these practices were kept secret because they offered alternatives to dominant power structures. One tradition got published and preserved, the other stayed oral and hidden. Edgar Allan Poe's decay metaphors became the blueprint for American Gothic, while plantation supernatural traditions remained folklore. Same time period, completely different cultural treatment. Guess which tradition Hollywood chose to adapt? What haunted Southerners was losing economic power, not confronting slavery's legacy. And after the Civil War, the South's economic stronghold, mainly using free labor, was gone, and they would struggle. But in the North, we'd see the birth of a new age of excess, what Mark Twain called the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age continued America's obsession with European customs, but with the flair of excess.
Nothing exceeds like excess.
It's kind of like when billionaires today build mega mansions. Victorians were kind of like the McMansions of their time. We roll our eyes at the excess the same way people did back then.
And here's the kicker.
Rich Americans built gaudy knockoffs of European palaces, and when those rotted, we called them haunted. So Victorian mansions became horror icons, while Greek Revival plantations became wedding venues. The psychology behind this choice is revealing. Making the Victorian mansion haunted was a rejection of those Gilded Age values.
Victorian homes decayed. Their fading wallpaper became the perfect metaphor for wealth rotting from the inside.
Just like plantations.
So when we turned Victorian mansions into horror icons, we were rejecting not just American excess, but our cringy attempts to play European royalty.
Victorians even built superstition into their homes.
Victorians were very superstitious people. And when I read about this, I decided to check my own house. On the third step down to our stairs, the stair railing is different. It's been changed a little bit. They would do this as a way to trip up any evil spirit.
One Vermont Victorian even inspired Shirley Jackson. Her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, turned creaking halls and stained wallpaper into the blueprint for the haunted house story we know today.
Across from the church is the old Walloon Sacking. The family will stated to leave it as is. The haunted Jennings Hall inspired Shirley Jackson to write The Haunting of Hill House.
You don't have to be a lit scholar to get this. Shirley Jackson basically gave us the haunted house playbook. And Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House has been made at least 3 times on the screen. First in 1963, then again in 1999 with the film The Haunting starring Catherine Zeta-Jones, and then most recently in 2018 with The Haunting of Hill House.
3 adaptations, same Victorian blueprint, the pattern reinforces itself.
Most antebellum homes are lost to history, burned to the ground, or leveled by years of neglect. Nottoway has endured and enters a new chapter under new ownership.
Flames shooting out of the largest standing antebellum mansion in America. This was the scene last night in White Castle.
Instead of letting these homes rot, culture gave antebellum homes a makeover, a romantic one. And that's where the real horror lies, in what we erase.
And yet, here's the irony. Plantations already market themselves as haunted. The Myrtles Plantation calls itself the most haunted house in America, built on a ghost story about a woman named Chloe. But in movies, these same houses aren't haunted.
They're revered historic landmarks or romantic backdrops. The question isn't which houses are haunted, it's which hauntings we're brave enough to face. Think about it. We turned the symbols of British oppression into horror icons, but kept the symbols of American oppression as romantic. We'll confront England's ghosts, but not our own.
Which is why to this day, Magnolia Plantation is supposed to be haunted.
Tour guides at Magnolia Plantation walk visitors through the old slave hospital and overseer's home, with letters describing sickness spreading through enslaved families. These aren't Gothic metaphors, they are lived hauntings.
This was some years ago. I got up out of my bed one morning and ended up on this plantation. Took forever for me to find. I took that as a sign that I shouldn't be going, but I ended up going anyways. At the time, there were a lot of road closures. Like, it kept detouring. My GPS kept detouring me. And then I eventually ran up on it. A park ranger was standing out and was able to point me in the direction of where I should be going.
We also have a letter from the overseer to Mr. LeCount telling him that the blacksmith from Shallow Lake, Daniel, became ill, and they brought him up here to the hospital. He later died. But when the house is burned down, then the family moves over here, and they turn this into their home in 1860.
Here's a contradiction. The Myrtles Plantation literally markets itself as America's most haunted house. Slave narratives used Gothic themes to expose brutal realities. The precedent for plantation horror exists, and Hollywood keeps remaking Hill House instead. The pattern reveals the choice. TikTok is full of ghost tours where visitors swear they see shadows on the stairs or catch orbs in the mirrors. In other words, we already market plantations as haunted, just not in films, not in the cultural shorthand. On screen, they're still wedding venues or historical landmarks, not horror icons. That gap is its own ghost story.
And here's the irony.
Even Brer rabbit tales, those came from enslaved folklore that white authors repackaged in lost cause mythology. The original stories were there, but they got sanitized and romanticized. But Victorian homes were not the only ones with superstitious practices. Look at this home in Georgia, an antebellum home. The roof is painted a paint blue. This was adopted from Gullah Geechee culture, which was believed to ward off evil spirits.
We just chose not to amplify it culturally, but here's the difference. When Victorian mansions appear in pop culture, they're haunted. When plantations appear, they're romantic backdrops. Same architectural grandeur, completely opposite cultural coding. But what happened to plantations?
After the Civil War, a new narrative emerged, the lost cause. This mythology rebranded the Confederacy as noble and slavery as benign. And here's what sealed the deal. Gone with the Wind. Released during the Great Depression, it turned plantation trauma into romantic grit, the story of fighting for a lost home during the lost cause. Meanwhile, Victorian homes were becoming old and antiquated, two different cultural paths for the same era's architecture. Think about that timing. One movie convinced America that plantations were romantic, while Victorian houses were becoming horror icons. That's not coincidence, that's cultural choice. Gone with the Wind to this day is still the highest grossing film in film history, so its legacy lives on beyond cultural and creative, but also financial. But Gone with the Wind wasn't the first. Hollywood's very first blockbuster was Birth of a Nation, a film that glorified plantation life and the Klan. To some audiences, it was nostalgic epic. To others, it was horror. That divide in perspective has shaped America's cinema ever since. And it didn't stop with Gone with the Wind. Even The Notebook staged romance across various plantation sites. Gen Z is already treating plantations as haunted spaces. Will this generation break the pattern? Let me know your thoughts. I want to hear from you.
Even today, many plantations are packaged as photogenic destinations.
But so are Victorian homes, also bed and breakfasts, venues for weddings, and used for romantic backdrops in various types of stories. Here's the psychology. We inherited slavery from Britain, but America perfected it into something uniquely profitable after the Revolutionary War. Cotton made these plantations symbols of American independence, built on a foundation we're still reckoning with. That's why Victorian homes feel safer to haunt. British oppression is someone else's ghost story, but American plantation wealth, that ghost story is ours. Which is exactly why I created this design. If Hollywood won't acknowledge these haunted houses, maybe we can. This shirt says what needs to be said. This is a haunted house. Simple, direct, impossible to ignore. And honestly, it's gonna start conversations wherever you wear it. I'm dropping a limited first run, but the waitlist gets early access and decides the final details. Links below if you want to see the full design and be part of flipping this script. Next time you see a plantation wedding photo, ask who decided this wasn't haunted. My shirt answers that question. This is a haunted house.
Because when we borrow images from the past, we inherit their ghosts too. Context matters. The ghosts may not be missing, they're hiding in plain sight. The Gothic tradition understood that the most beautiful houses hide the darkest secrets. We learned to fear Victorian decay because literature taught us to. But somehow, that same Gothic lens didn't seem to stick to plantations.
Even after Southern Gothic would be pioneered by folks like William Faulkner and Toni Morrison.
In films, we've mostly kept those ghosts out of sight.
Here is the only nighttime plantation tour in Louisiana. Just outside New Orleans sits the oldest documented house in the lower Mississippi River Valley, the Destrehan Plantation. And it's haunted. People in this tour have said to seen apparitions in the photos taken here. NOLA Ghost Riders takes you through the grounds of this house and you learn about the history behind the family, how the house was built, and what life was like back then.
And today, plantations like Destrehan even host night tours, selling themselves as haunted attractions during the night, but hosting weddings during the day.
But something's shifting. Gen Z grew up after George Floyd, after Get Out, after conversations previous generations avoided. They're exploring plantation sites as haunted spaces on TikTok, asking questions that make older generations uncomfortable. But here's the thing, they're still consuming Hollywood horror that trains them to see Victorian decay as scary and plantation columns as romantic.
The stories we tell now will determine whether Gen Z breaks the pattern or repeats it.
They're curious enough to explore plantation ghosts, but will they have the cultural framework to recognize what they're actually seeing?
Every Halloween, we pay to be scared in fake Victorian mansions while real American horror stories become brunch venues. The ghosts aren't gone, they're just waiting for us to see them. So maybe the haunted house trope isn't worn out at all. Maybe it just needs a change of address. The real ghosts are waiting in the houses we've been too afraid to confront. And if you want to hear the missing ghost, the next video shows how erasure hides inside the happiest places and how to tell those stories with care, entertaining, challenging, and yes, cathartic perspectives.